Hello again, my name is Steve Hillis, and this is the first in a series of videos where we're going to talk about inequality in America. Inequality of what? Well, we're going to talk about inequality of wealth, income, and consumption in the United States. And we're going to start out with a little pie chart here, data from 2007 showing the share of all income received by each 20% of families in the U.S. The top quintile, the richest families, take home about 47%, a little over 47% of all income in the United States. If you move down to the second 20%, that drops off to 23.3%. The third or middle quintile, 15.6%. Now we're beginning to move towards households that have lower incomes. Well, of course, the next to bottom quintile, the fourth quintile, 9.7%. And once we get to the very lowest, the poorest 20%, they're taking home under 5%, 4.1% of all income. Now, if you want to look at the minimum annual income, you need to be in what fraction or share of the population. To be in the top 1/2 of 1% back in 2007 required a whopping income of $1.8 million. To be in the top 1%, $389,000, the top 5%, $197,000, and so forth. The income, the family income that broke the share of the population into equal halves was $60,000. So that's one measure of the kind of the middle income range. Now, if income is distributed very unequally in the United States, wealth is distributed far more unequally than income. Here again, we're looking at the share of all wealth owned by each 20% of families in 2007. Here, the richest 20% of all families owned a massive 85% of all wealth. The second 20%, 11%. By the time we hit the middle or third quintile, we see they only owned about 4%. The fourth 20%, only 1%. And the poorest 20% actually had negative net worth, minus 1% of all wealth. In other words, well, they owed more than they owned. They had greater debts than they had assets. Well, that kind of captures basically how income and wealth is distributed in the United States, which kind of points out why some people complain so much about the so-called 1% higher income earners taking home this huge slice of the pie. That's what this little cartoon illustrates. Now, we already pointed out that wealth is distributed unequally in the United States, very unequally, and this graph kind of backs it up. Here we're looking at the mean and median net worth from 1962 to 2010. And what this graph is showing us is that, first of all, wealth is distributed very, very unequally because the mean level of wealth in the United States, shown with these light-colored bars, is much lower than the median level of wealth. The median level of wealth is the level of wealth that divides the population into equal halves. That's different than the median or average. When you see such huge differences between median and mean values, that's telling you that the distribution you're looking at is extremely skewed. In essence, a few people, a small share of the population, own a disproportionate share of wealth, and that's pulling up the average. But if you look at the level of wealth that would divide the population in equal halves, again, the median value, well, that's much smaller than the mean value. So, the point is this is showing us, first of all, that wealth distributions in the United States are very skewed, and they seem to be showing that they're becoming more and more skewed over time as we look at data from 1962 to 2010. The fact that the mean net worth in the U.S. is so much higher than the median net worth is strong evidence of the unequal distribution of wealth in the U.S. Now that leads us to a more fundamental question, which is, which of these measures, conceptualizations of social inequality, is more useful, wealth or income? Well, there's some debate over this. Looking at the distribution of wealth and looking at the distribution of income gives researchers two very different views of the amount of inequality in American society. Which economic measure, wealth or income, should be emphasized? Well, again, we get disagreements. Here we have a quote from Ellen Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, and he made the case for wealth. Quote, ultimately, we are interested in the questions of relative standards of living and economic well-being. We need to examine trends in the distribution of wealth, which, more fundamentally than earnings or income, represent a measure of the abilities of households to consume, end quote. Those who argue for the greater importance of income, on the other hand, make the case for wealth to actually have a significant impact on one's living standard. Well, you have to translate it into higher income. In other words, to be able to buy more stuff, have a better living standard, and so forth, you have to somehow translate wealth into actual purchasing power. And along the way, well, you cash things in, you declare income. And so maybe income really isn't as bad a measure as some people claim. I'll let you decide where you stand on that particular debate yourself, but let's move on. The one thing I want to point out, emphasize again, is that wealth is even more concentrated than income, distributed more unequally. And here you can see that from data from the Federal Reserve System from 2010. Here we have the distribution before tax income. You'll see that the bottom 90% earned about 55%, almost 56% of all income. The top 10%, 44.5%. Now look at the distribution of wealth in 2010. There, the bottom the bottom 90% of the bulk of the population owned just slightly over a quarter of all wealth, 25.5%. On the other hand, the top 10% owned almost 3/4, 74.5%. Clearly, wealth is distributed more unequally than income.